You wake to the low rumble of iron doors and distant footsteps, thick boots echoing on flagstone. Around you, the air is stale with soot and laundry steam, and the blanket on your cot feels more like a damp sack than comfort. The room is filled with other children, but you don't hear their whispers or their coughing. Only silence, your constant companion. You are a child in a Victorian workhouse, but unlike most, you are deaf. In a society obsessed with rigid moral categories, useful versus useless, normal versus abnormal, godly versus devianter, silence places you firmly on the wrong side of the line. The workhouse was never designed for care. It was punishment for poverty, a deterrent masked as relief. Established under the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act, the system placed entire families into brick institutions where they labored for food and shelter. Yet, for children, especially those with disabilities, the conditions were not just punishing, they were erasing. In the eyes of Victorian bureaucrats, deafness was often equated with stupidity. A child who could not speak or hear was assumed incapable of understanding. There were few efforts to communicate with deaf inmates, no sign language training, no written instructions. The workhouse masters were not teachers, they were overseers, disciplinarians, and often completely indifferent to nuance. To be deaf was to be dismissed, but even so, there were rules. Bells to wake up, bells to eat, bells to begin chores, bells to pray. You of course heard none of them, so you learned by watching shadows moving across the floor, eyes darting toward doors, and the clattering of spoons on tin plates that signaled the start of gruel. Missed the pattern, and punishment followed. In some workhouses, staff used physical methods to discipline deaf children. A tug of the ear, a slap of the cane. They believed repetition could hammer behavior into even the untouchable, but training was rarely paired with understanding. If you failed to scrub the floors properly, it was defiance. If you didn't stop working when the bell rang, it was insubordination. If you didn't pray, it was wickedness. No one considered you, simply didn't know. There was no specialized schooling, no allowance for different ways of learning. A few charitable institutions existed outside the workhouse system, places like the London Asylum for the deaf and dumb, but those were rare and usually reserved for children of the deserving poor. Inside the workhouse, education was limited to basic scripture and manual tasks. You were not taught to sign or read lips or communicate in any meaningful way. Instead, you were taught to conform, to obey, and above all, to be invisible. Your chores were menial: peeling potatoes, scrubbing chamber pots, mending broken bricks, and picking oakum. The latter was especially cruel. Oakum picking involved unraveling old ropes soaked in tar, using only your fingers. The tar tore your skin. The strands resisted every movement. For deaf children who couldn't hear instructions or warnings, this task was doubly dangerous. Many suffered permanent hand injuries. You did too. One finger was bent at an odd angle, and no one ever noticed. Your world narrowed to a few visual cues. You learned to anticipate the matron's lips moving in a certain rhythm meant punishment. You could tell when another child was about to be whipped. You began recognizing the look of exhaustion before it bloomed into collapse. Your eyes became your survival. Among the other children, your silence was both a curse and a kind of shield. Some pitied you, some mocked you. A few used your deafness for tricks, convincing you to disobey rules and watching as you got punished for it. But others grew attached to your quietness, your uncanny ability to spot things they missed. You were the first to notice when a guard left the door unlocked, the first to sense when someone was stealing food. You began to understand your disadvantage could also give you power. Sometimes, at night, when the ward fell still, you would sit by the window, watching the gaslights flicker through the fog. You imagined a world outside where people spoke with their hands, where children like you weren't beaten for misunderstanding, and where silence wasn't a crime. You didn't know such a world actually existed. Not in England yet, but across the Channel in France, where a man named DL had founded schools for the deaf using sign language. It was a revelation you would never hear of in the workhouse. Your parents, maybe they were dead, Or maybe they gave you up because they couldn't afford to raise a deaf child. In Victorian society, disability was often seen as divine punishment, a source of shame, or worse, an omen. Families with disabled children were sometimes shunned. For the poor, the choice wasn't even emotional, it was economic. They could barely afford to feed themselves, let alone care for a child who couldn't contribute wages. So the workhouse became your parent, your school, and your prison. You once tried to run. It was winter. You didn't get far before a constable brought you back, your shoes soaked through and your fingers raw from frost. They beat you, then locked you in the dark pantry for 2 days with only a bucket and stale bread. After that, you stopped running. But in your head, the window still opened to the gaslit streets in a world that might someday understand you. In some rare cases, visiting inspectors noticed children like you. There are record spas, but real love reformers writing complaints about the treatment of disabled inmates. A few clergymen argued for special instruction or improved charity. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and you aged faster than policy could shift. By the time you turned 10, your hands were permanently rough. Your back ached from scrubbing. You still couldn't communicate. You still didn't know your own name beyond the syllables others barked. The world inside the workhouse didn't want you to grow, only wanted you to disappear. And yet, something inside you remained alert, still watching, still decoding the world without words. You had no idea that a silent revolution was beginning outside the brick wall schools for the deaf, better methods of teaching, and the slow rise of rights for the disabled. It would come too late for you, but not for all. So you kept watching, listening with your eyes, waiting for something, anything to change. But what would it take for a society built on industrial progress and Christian moralism to see your silence as human, not defective? To build a space where disability was not a mark of failure, but of difference. By the time you turned 12, your hands were covered in small calluses and invisible scars, reminders of every chore, every slip-up, and every punishment endured in silence. In a workhouse, a child aged quickly, a deaf child, faster still. You were old without growing old, hardened by misinterpretation, by days that never changed, and by years that passed without a single spoken word you could understand. But while your ears could not take in sound, your mind absorbed patterns, the stiff routines, the faces of those who oversaw you, the glances passed between inmates, and the signals other children developed subtle and secret. Though the staff believed you incapable of comprehension, you understood far more than they ever suspected. You learned to read the lips of those who shouted often. You developed a sense for who would strike and who would simply sigh and look away. You even noticed which inspectors mattered, those rare visitors who carried notebooks and scowled at the filth. Sometimes, you watched as other children were taken out, adopted, perhaps, sent to work elsewhere. You weren't sure. They vanished and were not spoken of again. No one asked after them. In a place where survival took precedence, absence was not a mystery. It was simply another form of silence. What few people understood about those who considered themselves reformers was that silence could shape a person's world just as powerfully as noise. It didn't just isolate you. It changed the way you understood the passage of time, the structure of a room, and the rhythm of conversation. In the workhouse, your silence made others uncomfortable. Supervisors avoided eye contact. They yelled louder, as if increasing the volume would break through a wall it never could. And the other children, they eventually stopped asking you things. They stopped teasing too, which was something like a gift. But then one day, something happened. Something small, something that didn't belong. It was during washing duties in the laundry hall, a place of steam and sweat and slippery stone floors. You had just finished wringing out linens when a young woman appeared, her dress too clean for this place, her eyes too soft. She was visiting the matron, you gathered. A charity woman, probably. They came now and then. She had a small notebook, but unlike the others, she kept looking at you. You pretended not to notice, too used to scrutiny. But she didn't leave. Instead, she walked toward the wash troughs and bent beside you. Slowly, she opened the notebook and turned it so you could see. She had written something. One simple word. Name. You stared at it. No one had asked that in years. You picked up a piece of charcoal from the workroom bucket and scrawled something crooked on a ragged scrapier version of your name, or what you remembered of it. The letters were barely legible, learned in scattered pieces when older children whispered the alphabet at night. But it was enough. The woman smiled. Then, to your astonishment, she touched her fingers to her chin and then moved her hand outward a sign. You blinked. She did it again. Chin to air. The sign for thank you, though you didn't know that yet. What you knew, somehow, was that it was language. She tried a few more slow, gentle hand movements. You didn't understand most of them, but her expressions were clear, kind, and patient. It was the first time someone had tried to speak your language, even if you didn't know what your language was yet. And just like that, the moment passed. She stood, tucked the notebook back under her shawl, and left the laundry without a word. You never saw her again. But that moment opened a doorway in your mind. You began experimenting. With gestures, with touch, with expression. You noticed that younger children responded when you repeated that same chin-to motion. You didn't know what it meant, but it meant something. Over time, you and two other children developed a kind of code. Pointing, tapping, and miming actions. You showed them how to mimic sewing, or washing, or the rhythm of sweeping. They started following you more easily than they followed the matron's barking. In the eyes of the staff, your obedience improved. They thought you were finally learning. What they didn't know was that you were teaching yourself and others a new way of communicating. Still, you remained voiceless in any official sense. Deaf children were not counted in school rolls. They were not recorded in education plans. The idea of inclusive instruction did not exist in any meaningful form outside of the workhouse. A few pioneering institutions were forming, like the Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb in Margate or the Royal School for the Deaf in Derby. But those places were small, religious, and selective. The workhouse was neither equipped nor interested in sending you there. You did hear of one such school, eventually, not through a formal notice or kind staff member, but through a rumor. A girl named Elsie, who came from another parish, whispered about a cousin who had gone to a special school where they speak with their hands. You clung to the thought, not because you believed you'd ever go, but because you needed to believe such a place existed. One afternoon, during a particularly cold winter, you collapsed while peeling turnips in the workroom. Your hands had gone stiff and cracked, and your breath came in wheezes. They called the infirmary nurse not because they cared deeply, but because a child fainting near sharp tools was a liability. You were placed on a cot with a thin wool blanket, a sliver of bread, and a cup of bitter broth. The nurse did not speak to you. She just pressed your wrist, scribbled something in a ledger, and moved on. But while you lay there, dazed, you saw a boy in the cot beside you. His face was blank, but his right leg was twisted at an angle you'd seen before, likely from polio or an old injury never set properly. He didn't speak either, not because he was deaf, but because he had been in the infirmary too long to care. You looked at each other for a moment. Then you raised your hand and made the chin to air motion. He blinked, then nodded, a tiny nod, but you saw it. For a moment, you felt like two ghosts recognizing one another. How many others like you had passed through these halls unnoticed? How many had learned to live without language, without understanding, without even a name? You were not a case study. You were not a statistic. But if someone had been paying attention, perhaps they would have realized the truth. You were learning anyway. And still, no one saw. Not the matron, not the parish board, not the inspector who once commented on your good behavior as if you were a house pet, not even the occasional preacher who came to shout sermons at the children. They all mistook your silence for obedience, your watchfulness for dullness, and your gestures for coincidence. Years would pass before British society began to explore formal education for disabled children, before the idea of sign language gained any mainstream support, before people like you were seen not as defective, but as different. But in the meantime, there you were, growing older, growing stronger, and somehow still holding on to the memory of a kind woman who once wrote the word name in a notebook. You still didn't know what her visit meant, whether she was just a fleeting visitor or someone trying to change things. You never saw her again, but you never forgot her either. And that simple question, name, stayed with you. A word you couldn't hear but could see, and perhaps, one day, could answer. What might have happened if she had returned? The final years you spent in the workhouse were marked by slow, almost imperceptible change, not in the system itself, but in your own awareness of what lay beyond its walls. You were older now, though no one ever really kept track of your birthday. Time passed in seasons of heavier frost or thinner soup. You had become one of the quiet children, which in the world of Victorian institutions meant you were considered easier to manage. They trusted you with the water pump. They let you supervise the younger ones during laundry duty. You had become, in their eyes, a model inmate, not because of reform, but because you had adapted so completely to their indifference. But inside your mind, a different story was taking shape. You had developed your own visual language. It wasn't formal sign language no one had ever taught you, but it was yours. A mixture of gestures, facial expressions, and improvised signs that you used with a handful of other children who paid attention. You could signal hunger, pain, or danger. You could even tell a short story about who stole bread, or which supervisor would be angry that day. Most importantly, you could offer comfort. That unspoken code had become your resistance. Every time you taught another child to use it, you carved out a small space where the workhouse couldn't fully reach you. One winter, there was a cholera scare. 2 children died within a week. The infirmary filled, and the usual routines broke down. A handful of outside inspectors arrived, followed by a clergyman, and then a new kind of visitor, a man with a medical bag and serious eyes. You watched him carefully. He didn't shout. He didn't scoff. He asked quiet questions and wrote things in a notebook. But most importantly, he looked at the children not through them, but at them. You saw him pause by a girl with a clubbed foot, murmuring to his assistant. Then he saw you. He approached with careful steps. You instinctively stiffened, unsure of what to expect. But he didn't raise his voice or make assumptions. Instead, he pulled out a pencil and pad, just like the woman had years ago. He wrote, "Do you understand this?" You nodded slowly. Then, unbelievably, he began to gesture, not fluently, but clumsily, slowly. A few awkward hand movements, the kind you had once seen from that kind woman in the laundry. He tried again. This time, you understood one sign. "Hello." Your face lit up. You responded with your own version of the gesture. He smiled, not condescendingly, not with pity, but with recognition. Later that day, you were called into the matron's office, a rare event. Your palms were sweaty. You feared punishment, but instead, a letter was read aloud, not to you, of course, but over you. It stated that you were being transferred to a new institution, one where they had instruction for the deaf. You didn't fully understand the words, but the man's presence and his gestures told you enough. You were leaving, and just like that, after more than a decade within those walls, you were taken from the workhouse, not with ceremony, not with tears, but with a folded blanket, a single pair of boots, and a piece of stale bread. The journey was long. You rode in the back of a cart, for most of it, wrapped in your own silence. But your eyes were wide. For the first time, you were outside the gates, beyond the soot-stained bricks, in a world where gas lamps lined quiet streets and bakery smells filled the air. The world had never looked more alive. When you arrived at the new place, a modest brick building with ivy on the walls, you were terrified, but almost immediately, things felt different. The children here moved their hands as they spoke. Some used signs quickly, others slowly. They laughed. Some were blind, some deaf, some both, but they weren't ignored. They were taught. Your first lesson was the alphabet, spelled out on the hand. It took time. You had never been taught letters properly, but now, someone patiently held your hand and traced the shape of an A with their fingers, then a B, then a C. You cried that night, not because you were sad, but because someone finally cared whether you understood. In time, you learned to sign. You learned to read basic words. You even learned your name, not just to recognize it, but to spell it with your fingers. You began telling your story with your hands to children who actually listened. You learned that your language had structure, beauty, and nuance. You learned that others had fought for its place in the world, that French and British educators had spent decades developing systems, that deaf people had formed communities, even networks. Some had even published their own books and newspapers, but your heart remained with those left behind. You often thought about the workhouse children, the ones who still scrubbed floors in silence, the girl with the clubbed foot, the boy in the infirmary who had nodded at your first sign. Would they ever leave? One day, as a young adult, you returned to the outskirts of the city for a visit. Not to the workhouse itself, it had been converted into an industrial school by then, but to a nearby churchyard where you'd heard some former inmates had been buried. You stood quietly at the gate, hands in your coat pockets, the winter wind against your face, and you remembered the clang of iron doors, the smell of wet laundry, the soundless cries of children punished for things they didn't understand, and your own small hand, raised to say a word you didn't know yet. Thank you. The past could not be changed, but perhaps, now, it could be understood. Your life had been shaped by silence, but it was no longer defined by it. You had survived not because the system had helped you, but because you had found, in a brief moment of human kindness, a reason to hope, a reason to learn, a reason to speak, even if no sound came out. And in that quiet resistance, there was dignity. There was power. What if the workhouses had seen that from the beginning? You are led through tall, iron gates by a man in a dark coat. His keys jingle with authority, his steps sharp and rehearsed. Beyond the gates stands a building that resembles a country manor, but there's something off about it. The windows are too small, too high. The trees, if there are any, have been trimmed into unnatural submission. This is not a place of comfort. This is an asylum. It's the 1850s, and UVG just been admitted to one of England's many new public lunatic institutions. But you're not mad. At least, not in the way people today might define the term. You're a poor woman who once wept too much after your child died. Or perhaps a young man who speaks in circles, or someone who couldn't stop singing aloud in public. In the Victorian world, where moral discipline was king and anything out of place could be pathologized, the definition of madness stretched far and wide, catching many who simply didn't fit. The Victorian asylum system didn't emerge overnight. Before the 19th century, the mentally ill were often hidden in workhouses, prisons, or even chained in private homes. But by mid-century, Britain had embarked on a grand social experiment: build institutions that would cure madness with order, routine, and moral instruction. The 1845 Lunacy Act and County Asylums Act made it mandatory for counties to provide institutions for the mentally ill. What had once been a patchwork of private madhouses and occasional charity became a national system. Some of the new buildings were architecturally grand, complete with gardens and workshops, built to suggest progress and compassion. But the reality inside those stone walls was often very different. When you enter, they remove your clothing and give you a simple institutional gown. Personal possessions are considered a-risk objects of obsession or delusion. You're examined by a doctor, though the examination is brief. A few questions, a note scribbled down, then your file is marked and your diagnosis assigned: melancholia, mania, idiocy, or the ever-flexible moral insanity. Victorian psychiatrists, or alienists as they were called, believed that mental illness could be identified through physical signs, especially on the face and skull. Phrenology, though pseudoscientific, was still popular. A high forehead, that's intelligence. A protruding brow, prone to aggression. Even hair color and eye movement were subject to interpretation. For women, especially, deviations from prescribed gender behavior were often considered madness. A wife who refused to obey her husband, a mother who didn't show affection, a spinster who read too much. All of them could be committed if a male relative said the word. The asylum's philosophy revolved around moral management. The idea was simple. Madness was not just an illness of the brain, it was a moral failing, a disorder of the will, the soul, the conscience. And so, patients were subjected to a strict routine meant to reform their internal compass. Wake up with the bell, clean your cell, pray, work, walk silently in the garden if permitted, speak only when spoken to. Meals were taken in silence. Misbehavior meant seclusion or physical restraint. You might be assigned to work in the laundry or the bakery. The goal was purpose. The doctors believed idleness bred delusion, and hard work could purify the soul. Some patients responded well to this structure, but for many, especially those with cognitive disabilities, trauma, or neurological conditions, the rules only deepened the confusion. The treatments were rudimentary and often cruel. You might be prescribed cold water therapy immersion in icy baths to shock the mind into clarity, or rotational therapy, where patients were strapped into a chair and spun until dizzy. Bloodletting was still used by more traditionalist doctors. Some even administered purgatives or induced vomiting, all in the name of balance. There was also the matter of surveillance. You are never alone. Every movement, every murmur is noted by attendants. You begin to censor yourself. You stop humming. You suppress laughter. You speak less. Soon, you internalize the gaze, watching yourself, wondering whether your thoughts will betray you. And then there are the wards. Men and women are separated. The noisy are isolated. The violent are restrained. There are padded cells, though fewer than people assume. More common are locked rooms with little furniture. Patients who resist the routine might be placed in a straitjacket, not as punishment, they say, but for their own safety. You're not mad, but your days become monotonous, your identity eroded. Over time, you begin to question yourself. Maybe you are broken. Maybe the dreams you once had really were delusions. The people around you shuffle in silence, lost in their own loops of thought. Some rock back and forth. Some whisper prayers. Some speak to people who aren't there. And some stare at the wall for hours, as if waiting for the bricks to respond. Yet even here, there are moments of life. In the garden, if you are allowed, there you see birds landing on frost-covered branches. You smell the smoke from the asylum chimney. Once, you find a discarded piece of chalk and draw a picture on a stone. It's a house. Not this house, one from a memory. No one notices. No one erases it. There are visiting days, but not everyone receives them. Some patients have been entirely forgotten. Others are visited only by doctors or parish officials. Family members, once so eager to have someone taken away, rarely return. A brother may have signed the commitment form, but he will not sit beside you now. Sometimes, the asylums are overcrowded. The system, built with optimism, cannot keep up with demand. By the 1860s, many institutions are bursting at the seams. Beds are crammed into hallways. Staffing is inconsistent. New ideas for treatment begin to appear: occupational therapy, music therapy, but they remain experimental. For most, the routine persists. Eat, pray, work, be watched. And through it all, the definition of madness continues to shift. Doctors debate whether epilepsy is mental or physical, whether homosexuality is a disease or a crime, whether deafness is a kind of moral blindness. Disabilities and differences are often lumped together. The lines blur between intellectual disability, mental illness, and social deviance. The asylum becomes a catch-all for everything that doesn't fit in the neat Victorian order. But some resist. Reformers begin to speak out. The lunacy commissioners investigate abuses. Scandals emerge, patients restrained for years, others kept long after recovery. Writers publish. Charles Dickens, after visiting several institutions, expresses concern about the dehumanizing treatment. The public begins to ask questions, and you remain within the stone walls, one among many. Perhaps, in time, you will be released. Perhaps you will die there, unrecorded. But your presence, your silent endurance adds to the growing awareness that something is deeply wrong with the system. Still, for now, you sit quietly on a wooden bench beneath a drafty window, folding laundry that isn't yours, watching the snow fall in precise, drifting patterns. You don't speak. You don't shout. You only think, is this place helping you or simply hiding you? Outside the asylum walls, Victorian society was transforming. Cities swelled with industry. Trains raced across the countryside. Telegraphs clicked with urgency. And still, within the stone silence of the asylum, time moved differently, slow, repetitive, oppressive. You had begun to count your days, not in months or years, but in patterns. The scrape of your shoes against the tiled floor as you walked the corridor. The soundless clink of metal spoons against enamel bowls. The chiming of bells that told you when to eat, when to work, and when to be silent. You were not a person in the eyes of the institution. You were a patient, a case, a disorder with limbs. It was not uncommon, in this era, for people with disabilities, mental, developmental, neurological, to be diagnosed with lunacy, even when no psychological illness existed. The asylum was a place for the misunderstood, epileptics, autistic individuals, the blind or mute. Anyone who could not participate in society's rigid norms could be detained under the broad and unforgiving umbrella of madness. Asylums, in theory, were intended for treatment, but treatment often meant control. Moral management, the leading philosophy of care, suggested that a structured life, built on Christian virtue and productive labor, could restore sanity. Yet, in practice, this structure often suppressed identity rather than healed it. It forced conformity, not recovery. You'd have learned by now how to appear manageable. You kept your eyes lowered when a nurse passed. You completed your daily tasks without resistance. You smiled faintly when addressed, though you rarely understood the question. You weren't too sure if this was healing or survival, but it kept you out of the isolation room. Some of the other patients were not so lucky. There was Miss Dobson, a woman in her 50s, who had been brought in by her nephew after he inherited her estate. She had protested too loudly, so they labeled her delusional. There was Mr. Clark, who had suffered a stroke and could no longer speak clearly. He had been a cobbler once. Now, he spent his days threading pieces of cloth through holes in a wooden board. Therapy, they called it. The truth was, many inmates were simply poor, or sick, or unwanted. Once inside, few ever left. Some did find structure helpful. The daily chores gave them purpose. The gardening when allowed offered peace. But for most, including you, the asylum existed in a fog of overexposure. Too many people, too much observation, and never enough privacy. And still, change was on the horizon. In 1859, a book by Dr. John Connolly, one of the leading alienists, argued against the use of mechanical restraints. His ideas sparked debate. Should patience be tied down, or should kindness be enough? At the Hanwell Asylum, he experimented with non-restraint techniques using routine, gentle supervision, and patient dialogue to encourage calm behavior. For a few institutions, this became the gold standard. But elsewhere, especially in underfunded county asylums, the old ways continued. You didn't know any of this, of course. You only knew that sometimes patients stopped returning to the day room, and no one explained why. Then, one year, a new matron arrived. She was not young, but she walked briskly, and she observed things others ignored. She spoke to you once not to lecture, but to ask a question. You didn't answer, not because you couldn't, but because you weren't sure how. Still, she didn't frown. She waited. In time, she brought in small changes. She introduced quiet reading hours. She allowed drawing materials in the garden. She asked attendants to address patients by name rather than by number or diagnosis. Some scoffed at her reforms. Others followed reluctantly. But to you, it felt as if a veil had lifted, just slightly. It was around this time you began to remember your dreams more clearly. They had never left, but now they came into focus. Not dreams of escape, but dreams of recognition. Of someone calling your name in a gentle voice. Of walking through the asylum and being seen not as a condition, but as a self. One evening, during a chapel service, you sat beside another patient who hummed softly. The hymn was familiar, though you couldn't recall its name. When you glanced over, you noticed his fingers moving not in a nervous twitch, but in deliberate patterns. Signs, not the structured British Sign Language of the schools, but something similar. A blend of homespun gestures. You responded with a simple sign of your own, a greeting. His eyes lit up. In that moment, across a sea of silence, a current flowed between you. It wasn't much, but it was language. You began meeting him in the garden. You traded signs, creating meaning where there had once been only stillness. Over time, others joined. A group of patients who couldn't tour, wouldn't speak, began sharing your gestures. It wasn't formal, it wasn't institutional, but it was real. Eventually, an attendant noticed. He did not reprimand you. Instead, he brought it up with the matron, who, to your astonishment, encouraged it. She said she had read about manual methods being used in deaf schools. She asked if anyone could teach her a few signs. It was the first time you had ever taught someone with power how to understand you. Still, this flicker of recognition did not erase the deeper problem. The asylum system remained flawed. Overcrowding, understaffing, and lack of individualized care persisted. Most patients would never see freedom. For many, especially those with long-term disabilities, the asylum became a lifelong sentence. But your small victories mattered. Your signed conversations, your drawings in the margins of old medical reports, your quiet endurance, they chipped away at the edges of the institution's indifference. Outside, society still misunderstood people like you. Many Victorians believed mental illness was contagious, or hereditary, or a sign of moral decay. But slowly, a few began to question these assumptions. Reformers published treatises. Parliament debated the funding of asylums. Some journalists even wrote about conditions behind closed doors. And though your name never appeared in their papers, your life helped shape the truth they uncovered. Was the asylum curing madness, or merely redefining it to fit the needs of an orderly society? Years passed, though you rarely marked them with numbers. There were no calendars in your cell, no clocks you could read easily. Time was measured by the changing of staff, the graying of fellow inmates' hair, and the expansion of silence in your own thoughts. The asylum, though aging like everything else, remained largely unchanged in its routines. New faces arrived, some frightened, some furious, most confused. Others disappeared quietly, carted away under white sheets or transferred to other institutions. Occasionally, someone was discharged and left standing at the iron gate, blinking at a world they hadn't seen in decades. Few ever returned, and fewer still were spoken of again. By now, you had lived most of your adult life behind these stone walls. You were no longer young. Your hair had silvered, and your posture bent slightly with fatigue. Yet, oddly, you were more visible now than ever before. Staff consulted you. Younger patients approached you with uncertain steps. You had, in your own quiet way, become a kind of elder someone who understood the language of the building and the unsaid rules of its daily survival. You remembered a time when no one thought you capable of understanding a sentence. Now, attendants asked your opinion quietly, not because of official recognition, but because you had endured, and in enduring, you had learned more than most. The matron who had once encouraged your signing had long since retired. Her successor was less kind and more bureaucratic, but he didn't undo her small changes. The chalkboards in the day rooms remained. Patients were still allowed paper and charcoal for drawing. Those signs you had passed around in secret were now quietly accepted, even if no one officially taught them. But still, the core problem persisted. You weren't here for healing. You were here because society had nowhere else to place you. In the eyes of the state, your difference, your inability to function normally, was a burden to be managed, not a humanity to be honored. Many of your fellow inmates were much like you. Not mad, not dangerous, but inconvenient. A girl with seizures, a man who stuttered uncontrollably, a woman who refused to speak at all. Each had been swept into the asylum by the vague, elastic definition of insanity that governed Victorian medicine. Once inside, escape became unlikely. There were files on every patient, dusty ledgers with notes that described your fits of silence or habitual slowness. Nothing about your drawings, nothing about the languages you helped teach, nothing about your calm presence in a ward that might have otherwise unraveled. Then one morning, a stranger appeared in the main hallway. He was younger than most of the doctor's sharp suit, nervous energy, a pencil already in hand. A new inspector, you gathered, perhaps from the Lunacy Commission. These visits were rare but significant. They could mean funding reviews, new policies, and sometimes even closures. The inspector walked through the ward, glancing at patients as he passed. He asked questions, scribbled answers. Some of the nurses pointed him toward you. When he arrived, you stood without being asked. He looked surprised, as if expecting incoherence. Instead, you offered a sign, just a simple one, a greeting. He blinked. "Do you speak?" he asked. You nodded slowly, then pointed to the chalkboard beside you. You picked up a stub of chalk and wrote, in steady letters, "I communicate, not always with words." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled, a real one. He knelt beside the chalkboard and wrote beneath your message, "How long have you lived here?" You paused. You weren't sure. So you simply wrote, "Since I was young, still here." The next day, he returned with a folder. He sat with you in the day room and opened it. Inside were your records pages upon pages of cold observations. Sullen behavior, poor social skills, unlikely to reform. You recognized the handwriting of doctors long gone. He tapped one line and raised an eyebrow. "Do you agree with this?" You read it slowly, unfit for society. Then, without hesitation, you picked up the chalk and wrote, "Society has never tried to fit me." The man was silent for a long time. Then he thanked you and left. You didn't expect anything to change. Visitors came and went. Most forgot you the moment they left the gates. But weeks later, the asylum director called you to his office. He told you there was a new programmer kind of home, not a hospital, a charitable institution, funded by reformers, where patients could live in small cottages, tend gardens, and learn trades. You'd have your own room. You could leave the grounds. You could choose when to speak or not. It wasn't quite freedom, but it wasn't the asylum. They offered you a place. You accepted, of course. You packed slowly, carefully folding your few belongings, your chalk, and the worn blanket you'd had for decades. The other patients watched you leave. Some waved, some didn't understand. You signed a small farewell to one of them. He smiled, but didn't respond. Outside, the air felt different, softer, perhaps. The wind didn't carry the weight of confinement anymore. The sky, though gray with the threat of rain, felt impossibly wide. Your new home was modest but warm, a stone cottage with ivy creeping up the side, and a garden behind it that grew lavender and potatoes. You had your own key, a wooden chair by the window, a table where you could draw without asking permission. There was even a room where patients now called residents gathered to teach each other things. One day, a boy sat beside you and asked, through signs, "Who taught you?" You paused, then signed back, "No one." Life. And in that small exchange, you saw the future stretching out, not without limits, not without struggle, but without walls. The Victorian asylum system would go on for many more decades, its structures becoming more medicalized and more bureaucratic, and eventually, in the 20th century, slowly dismantled. But the people who passed through its corridors, the misunderstood, the mislabeled, the abandoned, left behind stories too often untold. You were one of them. And even if no one had ever known your full story, even if no monument would bear your name, the truth remained. You had endured, you had learned, you had resisted, not with violence, but with presence, with chalk, with silence, with patient defiance. And long after the asylum crumbled into disuse, your life, once considered unworthy of freedom, would become part of the long, quiet history of those who survived the walls built to contain them. What might our world look like today if those voices had been heard from the very beginning? The fog clings to the stone like it belongs. They're thick, greasy, smelling faintly of coal and cabbage. You sit motionless on a patch of cold pavement just off Drury Lane, wrapped in a fraying shawl and gripping a wooden cup with stiff fingers. Passersby flow past you like a river of boots and cloaks, mostly ignoring your presence. But you've been doing this long enough to recognize the small signs, a flicker of hesitation in someone else's step, a sideways glance, the sudden drop of a penny into your cup without eye contact. You are disabled, and you are paranned in Victorian London. That is a precarious combination. To the untrained eye, the city is booming. Omnibuses rumble past, belching smoke. Factory whistles punctuate the day like grim clockwork. New buildings spring up near the Thames. But beneath this layer of industry and optimism, poverty clings to the city like soot on brick. And nowhere is it more visible than in the lives of those who beg to survive, especially those with visible disabilities. You are part of an unacknowledged underclass, one of the hundreds, perhaps thousands of men, women, and children with deformities, injuries, or congenital conditions who survive only through the generosity or discomfort of others. There is no welfare, no government subsidy, no disability rights movement. Your body is your burden, but also, oddly, your tool. You weren't always here. Perhaps you were born with a twisted foot. Or perhaps you were injured in a factory accident when you were just 9 years old. Maybe you had rickets as a child, softening your bones and bowing your legs. It doesn't matter. Once you could no longer work, you were no longer useful. The workhouse was an option. Yes, but you knew what happened there. Institutionalized, separated, treated like a burden. You chose the streets instead. Some called people like you mumpers or crippled beggars. In the public imagination, you were either pathetic or a fraud. The newspapers printed about faked injuries, about professional beggars who supposedly made more than honest workers. Satirical prints showed disabled men leaping up once they'd collected enough coins. The implication was always the same. Beggars were not to be trusted. But the truth was far more complicated and far more brutal. You woke at dawn in a tenement that barely qualified as shelter. Or perhaps you slept rough, curled under the eaves of a butcher's shop until the police shooed you off. You avoided the harshest of the peelers, the bobbies, who thought nothing of cracking a truncheon against someone's back. You knew which corners were good for coins and which were good for food scraps. You avoided rival beggars when possible, but occasionally you shared space, especially when the cold became dangerous. Some days, you disguised your injury to avoid attention. Other days, you emphasized it, pulling your sleeve back to show a stump, exaggerating your limp, holding your hand out in a way that made it tremble just slightly. It wasn't deception, it was strategy, a silent appeal to the guilt and piety of the passing middle class. Church sermons constantly reminded Londoners to give alms to the poor, but to do so wisely, deserving poor versus undeserving poor. This was the moral binary of the era. Widows and children were considered worthy of charity. Drunkards, the idle, and the disabled, strangely, were often lumped into the latter category. Why? Because your condition was assumed to reflect spiritual failings, or even sin. The word disabled wasn't even in common usage yet. People used terms like maimed, crippled, lunatic, or invalid. Each one carried shame. Each one marked you as other. Occasionally, you saw someone like yourself get lucky. A charitable gentleman might offer work as a bootblack or a coal runner. A kindly lady might offer soup or an old pair of shoes, but most simply passed by. The city's new obsession with self-help and productivity left little space for those who couldn't rise on their own. And still, you remained. On certain days, you wandered toward the riverfront, where wealth and poverty collided with brutal clarity. There, street performers danced beside amputees, begging in silence. Children sold matches. Blind fiddlers played to empty air. The Royal Hospital for Incurables was just a dream for most of you out of reach, reserved for the respectable sick. Sometimes, officials arrested beggars under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, which criminalized wandering abroad and begging. You knew the risk. At any moment, you could be pulled into a cart and sent before a magistrate, fined or imprisoned. But you also knew you had no alternative. The police, when not enforcing order, often simply looked the other way, tired of the endless cycle of arrest and release. There were other dangers too. Gangs sometimes exploited disabled beggars voting protection in exchange for a portion of your coins. Some even forced children with visible impairments to beg in specific locations. There were rumors, always whispered, that some injuries had been inflicted deliberately. You never knew if that was true, but the thought kept you up some nights. One of the few places you could rest without trouble was the steps of certain churches. St. Giles, St. Martin in the Fields, even the newer chapels that offered soup kitchens on Sundays. There, you sometimes received bread, and sometimes, even more valuable, warmth. A visiting missionary once gave you a pamphlet. It was called The Christian Duty of Charity to the Afflicted. You couldn't read it, but you kept it anyway. A charm, maybe, a relic of someone who once met your eyes, instead of pretending you weren't there. Occasionally, you glimpsed the world of reformers. Men in top hats walking briskly through the slums, scribbling in notebooks. They rarely spoke to you, but they were documenting the urban poor for parliamentary review, for royal commissions, for medical journals. One even included a sketch of a one-armed beggar in his report. That sketch could have been you, but your name would never be printed beside it. You were evidence, not a person, and yet you lived. Somehow, despite infection, injury, and indifference, you made it through another winter. You learned to scavenge effectively, to patch your own clothes, to sleep with one eye open. Your body may have been marked, but your will was intact. You existed where no one thought a person could. You watched the seasons change. You saw children grow into laborers. You saw gas lamps installed on streets where there had once only been lanterns. You saw reformers begin to speak of pauper lunatics and the defective classes. You heard whispers once in a while about something new. Institutions for the disabled. What were they? Relief, or another form of containment? And so, day after day, you sat near the edge of the city's wealth and watched the world pass by, still begging, still surviving, still invisible. How many others like you had been dismissed, not for their minds, but for their bodies? By the time spring returned to the city, your knees ached less from the cold and more from the cobblestones each. Day of begging left a mark not just on your pride, but on your joints, your skin, and your soul. Your usual spot, tucked between the entrance of a butcher's shop and a cart vendor's corner, had become your station. Some people began to recognize you not as a person, not by name, but as a fixture of the street, a part of the scenery, like the soot-covered bricks, or the piles of refuse, or the dogs sniffing at rotting vegetables. There was a strange comfort in routine, in knowing where your next crust of bread might come from, or which constable was likely to look the other way if you stayed quiet. The streets weren't safe, but they were familiar. Familiarity became its own kind of safety. But not all familiarity was welcome. One morning, while brushing grime from your sleeve and preparing your chalk sign for the day, a man approached. Not a donor, not a constable, a recruiter. He spoke quickly, with a toothpick in his mouth and the air of someone doing you a favor. He was looking for beggars, he said, the kind that made people feel something. He worked with a showman running exhibitions in Clockenwell and Camden Town. You'd only have to sit there, he said. Maybe grunt a little, wear a robe. They'll think you're half mad. You'll make more in a week than you do in a month. You'd heard about these places, the freak shows, the exhibitions of human curiosities, the woman with a beard, the twins joined at the hip, the man with two thumbs on each hand. They were mocked, stared at, and gawked over, but they were also paid, in coin and food and something else, a form of stage-managed power. For some, that was enough, better than starving. You hesitated, but ultimately, you said no not aloud, then by turning away. Not everyone did. Some of your acquaintances, the girl with the clubfoot, the blind man with the tin whistle, took jobs with the exhibitions. They told you they were treated well enough. Warm food, straw beds, a kind of celebrity. But you saw what they endured. Audiences pointing, men jeering, children poking. Still, it begged the question, was there dignity in street begging, or only a different kind of invisibility? As the summer months rolled in, a few minor reforms swept the city. More soup kitchens opened in the poorer parishes. A campaign from the Times raised funds for disabled veterans of the Crimean War. And a new society. The Ragged School Union began offering basic education to street children. But you were too old for school, too poor for charity, and too disabled for labor. You sat between all the categories, seen by none. And yet, one afternoon, someone did see you. She wore a faded green shawl and carried a bundle of leaflets. Not a missionary, not a reformer, but something in between. She introduced herself with a card that read, "Society for the Relief of the Permanently Infirm Poor. A new effort," she said. Small grants, visits, maybe clothing, maybe placement in one of the newer almshouses. You said little. You always said little. But she took down your name. More. What you gave as your name and said she'd return. And surprisingly, she did. Twice a month, she brought a bread loaf or clean stockings. Once, even a small tin of salve for your cracked hands. You never asked for these things. She simply left them and spoke kindly. You had learned not to trust too quickly, but her presence made the world feel slightly less cruel. She asked once if you'd ever been to a doctor. You had, years ago, briefly, after collapsing in an alleyway. He'd said nothing helpful, just scribbled a note and left you with vinegar to rub on your joints. But she insisted. She took you to a local clinic near Whitechapel, where a physician looked you over with a frown and too many questions. He called your condition congenital deformity with secondary complications. You didn't know what that meant, but he prescribed rest, liniment, and if possible, work with limited standing. Work, always the dream. But who would hire you? And yet, something shifted. The woman arranged for you to assist at a chapel charity, pantry washing vegetables, folding linens, and sorting potatoes. It wasn't much, a few hours each week, but it came with food and warmth and no pavement. You still begged on most days, but now you did so with the knowledge that, somewhere, there was a place you could rest. It wasn't a solution, but it was a foothold. You began to notice others, like you people, who had slipped through the cracks, but were trying, in their own quiet ways, to climb back. A boy with a shriveled arm, who sold buttons. A girl with cataracts, who read prayers aloud at night for coppers. A man missing a leg, who fixed tin pots for a farthing each. London's streets were hard, but they were alive, and within that grimy web of alleyways and arches, a kind of underground support system existed, one forged in necessity, not charity. Still, prejudice lingered. The fear of fraud, the disdain for dependence, the belief that disability was something to pity or punish or ignore. Even so, you endured. In the winter, the fog returned, heavier and darker than before. But you had new gloves this time, and a bit more bread. And when you took your place beside the butcher's wall, someone greeted you not with coins, but with words. Morning, miss, a small thing, but not nothing. You wondered what might change in your lifetime. Would there ever be laws to protect people like you? Hospitals that welcomed rather than confined? Jobs that didn't require perfection? Or would the streets always be the only option? And what would it take for society to see you not as a blemish on the city's surface, but as part of its fabric, its past, its resilience, its truth? The years went on, and London changed its skin like a snake. Old tenements torn down, cobbled alleys widened into clean-swept roads, and gaslights replaced by electric ones. But beneath the polished storefronts and Pauline's promises, you were still there, still sitting near your patch of pavement, still folding your hands around a tin cup, still surviving. The word beggar never left your shoulders, even when you started spending your mornings helping clean the church pantry and folding handbills for the missions. People still saw you as the same curled figure with the twisted leg and patched shawl. That didn't change. But you had changed. You had learned how to patch boots using a thick needle and waxed thread. You had learned to keep potatoes from sprouting by keeping them in shadow. You had even learned the names of 2 herbs that help dull pain on cold mornings. None of this came from charity. It came from watching, from listening, from not disappearing. One morning, you found a new poster pasted to the alley wall. the Metropolitan Association for the Better Housing of the Disabled and Destitute. A public meeting, free admission, guest speaker, Florence Nightingale's former assistant. Date, Tuesday. You stared at the paper long after most had walked past. Not because you expected change, but because, for once, the word disabled had appeared in public without mockery or menace. It wasn't a slur or a whisper. It was printed, named. The meeting was held in a modest hall in Hope. You went dressed in your best, which wasn't much. You sat near the back, behind two old dock workers and a girl with braces on her legs. The air was thick with tobacco and damp wool. The speaker read from a paper. His voice was steady, his tone grave. He spoke of the moral obligation to support the afflicted, of institutions that could educate, not just contain, of children with spinal injuries who might still be taught to read, of the blind who could be taught to sew, of the deaf who could learn trades. You wanted to believe him, but then he said something else, that such people, if properly managed, might still become useful to society. That word again, useful, as if you were a tool that had dulled but could still be sharpened, as if your right to exist depended on your ability to produce something measurable. You left before the applause began. Back in the street, the fog had thinned. You passed by the fruit stall where the woman sometimes gave you bruised apples. You sat beside your usual stoop and watched a young boy with a bent spine try to drag a sack of coal across the stones. His face was tight with pain, but he didn't cry out. You helped him, without a word. No one applauded. That night, a constable passed by and didn't shoo you away. He nodded. You didn't nod back. You didn't have to. Later that week, the woman from the charity returned. She brought a newspaper clipping. "Read this," she said. "It's about that meeting. You couldn't read it, but you kept it anyway, folded tightly in the pocket of your skirt. A sign, perhaps, that your life had entered the record in some distant, abstract way. You had no family, no pension, no legacy, but you had survived, and one day, long after you were gone, your name written carefully in the back ledger of a forgotten chapel pantry would be found by a historian. They would see the line, Mary T., partial paralysis, Schumander, street regular, assisted through winter. And they might wonder, who was she? Just another beggar, or something more? Maybe they would trace the pattern of people like you, the ones who fell between categories, the ones whose names weren't in headlines, but whose footprints were in every street. They might finally ask, why was it that the most visible people in London, those who sat in plain sight every day, were the ones the city chose not to see? And if they looked closely enough, would they begin to understand? You sit very still, trying not to blink as the man with the cravat inches closer to your face. He smells faintly of bay rum and dust. His fingers, gloved in kid leather, trace along your temple and pause at the top of your scalp. He frowns, not because you've done anything wrong, but because your head does not align with the theory. It's the 1860s, and you've been brought to a small study above a gentleman's club in Bloomsbury. You're not here by choice. You are here because someone, your employer, perhaps, or your schoolmaster, thought you might be examined for moral defects. The man before you is not a doctor in the traditional sense. He is a phrenologist, and he believes that the shape of your skull reveals everything about who you are, your personality, your intelligence, your moral compass, and, more importantly, your defects. The room smells of candle wax and old varnish. Skulls reel and plaster line the shelves. Charts hang from the walls, labeled with precise, confident words. Destructiveness, secretiveness, philoprogenitiveness. Words you can barely pronounce, let alone understand. The man beside you runs a set of calipers across the back of your head and murmurs something about a flatness over the organs of consciousness. You don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. Phrenology had swept through Victorian Britain like a scientific wildfire. First introduced by Franz Joseph Gall in the late 18th century, it was the study of the skull's shape as a map of the human mind. Though long since debunked, at the time it passed for cutting-edge psychology. The Victorians, ever obsessed with classification, adored phrenology. It allowed them to organize people into neat, moral boxes: genius or dullard, criminal or saint, mad or sane without messy ambiguity. And for disabled people, it offered a ready-made justification for marginalization. A child with cognitive delays might be said to have deficiencies in the organs of comparison. A man with a limp might be accused of laziness, his body merely reflecting a spiritual weakness. A deaf girl might be described as detached from the organ of language and thus considered unteachable. All of it is nonsense, but powerful nonsense. Phrenologists believed that certain parts of the skull corresponded to specific traits. The area behind the ears, for instance, was thought to govern aggression. A bulge above the eyebrows, that was your seat of intellect. A large bump at the crown of the head suggested religiosity. These conclusions were drawn not from rigorous study, but from confirmation bias and cultural prejudice. And yet, thousands believed them. Phrenological societies flourished in cities like Edinburgh, Manchester, and London. Lectures were held, pamphlets distributed. Even Queen Victoria reportedly entertained phrenological readings for her children. The upper classes used it to select servants. The military used it to evaluate recruits. Schools used it to sort children. You, unfortunately, were one of those children, born with a stutter and a tendency to stare at corners too long. You were quickly deemed peculiar, not dangerous, just off. Your teacher could never decide if you were clever or slow. So one day, you were marched into a study like this one, where a man in spectacles touched your head and declared you deficient in ideality. You were placed in a separate class afterward, a slower one. You noticed the phrenologist standing over you now taps a spot just above your ear and mutters again. Small benevolence, likely self-serving. You want to protest, but how does one argue with the shape of their skull? This is how it worked. Your body told a story you didn't write, and society believed it was true. At its core, phrenology was not about helping people. It was about control. It permitted Victorians to rank humanity. It let them pathologize poverty, criminality, and disability not as products of environment or injustice, but as signs of moral failure encoded in the bone. And while it was sometimes cloaked in kindness, let us understand their nature to better educate them. It more often justified exclusion. Phrenology was frequently used in asylums to support continued confinement. The patient's skull indicates a high degree of destructiveness. A report might read, and must remain under watch. It was used in workhouses to explain why certain paupers remained poor. It was used in criminal trials to bolster claims of innate evil. And in classrooms, it was used to tell children that they were by nature destined for less. And here you are now, sitting still under a stranger's touch, while he concludes your soul with a brass ruler. You look at the cabinet behind him, filled with labeled heads. Some are real, some are cast in plaster, all reduced to measurements. A bump, a dip, a number, a judgment. Somewhere, a clock chimes the hour. You exhale, slow and long. The man removes the calipers and writes notes in a ledger. You try to peek, but he shields the page. He stands, shakes your hand, and says, "You may go." His expression is neither cruel nor kind, merely clinical. He will send his findings to the person who sent you. You will not get a copy. Back on the street, the city seems louder than usual. Horses clatter past, and vendors call out over steaming grates. You slip back into the faceless crowd, back into a world where your head has already been read, your future already plotted. You wonder what they'll say about you. Will you be sent to a special school? Will your work assignment change? Will someone you barely know use your profile to justify a decision that will shape the rest of your life? You hadn't known your skull was speaking for you. But what happens to a society that listens to bone instead of voice? The diagnosis followed you like a shadow. You didn't receive a printed report, of course. No paper with your name in bold, no formal seal, just a whispered comment from the headmistress. We've had your phrenological assessment returned. You'll be placed in the simplified stream from now on. That was that. You didn't even know what simplified stream meant at first. But it became clear soon enough. Fewer lessons, fewer books, more time in the laundry room or mending socks for the schools, wealthier boarders. No more Latin, no more maps of faraway lands. You were told, in a pleasant tone, that you'd be better suited to practical work. The shape of your skull had determined your station. Phrenology in Victorian England had, by the 1860s, fully seeped into everyday life, though still called a science. It functioned more as an ideology, a convenient way for those in power to maintain hierarchies. Employers used phrenological guides to screen candidates. Police officers referenced head shapes when describing suspects. Even some midwives examined infants for early tendencies. For people with disabilities, especially children, the consequences were serious and long-lasting. A child with a misshapen head from hydrocephalus, likely feeble-minded. A girl who didn't smile on command, deficient in mirth. A boy who rocked back and forth or couldn't meet your eyes, lacking in social faculties. And so, decisions were made. Isolate him. Don't educate her. Send them to the asylum, the workhouse, or the charity hospital, but not the classroom, not the workplace, not into public life. You had known one boy, Jacob, from the orphanage, a quiet soul, with a tendency to recite poems to himself. His head was long and narrow, his eyes wide set. One day, a phrenologist came, examined him in front of the staff, and declared Jacob a melancholic with weak faculties of firmness. After that, Jacob stopped being invited to group lessons. Eventually, he stopped speaking aloud at all. Last you heard, he had been sent to a training colony for defective youth. You never saw him again. It wasn't just about learning. Phrenology affected where you lived, what kind of food you received, and whether or not you were punished or praised. Some doctors even recommended dietary regimens based on cranial readings. If your acquisitiveness was pronounced, they might restrict sugar. If your amativeness, the so-called love organ, was too large, they might assign you to more grueling labor, hoping to sap your spirit. The absurdity of it might have been laughable, had it not determined the entire course of people's lives. The sad irony: the more deficient your phrenological chart appeared, the less likely anyone was to listen to your own account of your experience. The test wasn't something you could fail. It was something that erased your voice entirely. You began to notice which heads were most trusted. Broad, masculine foreheads, chins with strong angles, symmetrical domes. These belonged to doctors, clergymen, and bankers. Their skulls were assumed to contain reason, discipline, and virtue. Yours, a little sloped at the back, a little soft above the temples, apparently did not. And yet, privately, you kept a notebook. You wrote in it each night, quietly, in pencil. Lists of birds you saw from the classroom window. Phrases you copied from half-finished library books. You didn't know what you'd do with them, only that the act of writing reminded you that your mind was still intact, still yours. You also learned slowly that some people were beginning to question phrenology. A physician at the Royal Free Hospital published a paper casting doubt on its measurements. A journalist in a penny illustrated paper wrote that skull shape was hardly proof of sin or virtue. Even Charles Dickens, though once fascinated by phrenology, mocked it in later writings as the art of bump shifting. Still, among the middle and working classes, phrenology retained a hold. It was easy to grasp, cheap to administer, and wrapped itself in the language of moral certainty. It appealed to those who wanted order in a messy world. By the time you were old enough to work, your phrenological label still followed you. Your references mentioned it sometimes directly, sometimes not. You were steady but slow, quiet but dull, better suited to manual work. And so, you worked as a seamstress in a cramped room near Shoreditch, as a cleaner in a school for girls, as an assistant at a grocer's, stacking potatoes while your back ached and your fingers went numb from cold. Your skull hadn't changed, but you had. You read more, quietly, in libraries that didn't ask questions. You copied articles into your notebook. You even tried to learn phrenology yourself, not because you believed in it, but because you wanted to understand how it had harmed you. You saw its tricks, the vague language, the pseudo-precision, and the way it played into bias. You even visited a public phrenological reading once, pretending to be curious. The man declared you passive and obedient. You smiled and left without a word. By then, things were starting to shift. The 1870 Education Act had passed. More children were being taught to read. More questions were being asked about institutional care, about fairness, and about the difference between intellect and compliance. Phrenology began to retreat from the medical establishment and linger mostly on the fringes, like a ghost that hadn't realized it was dead. But the damage it had done would remain for decades. You kept your notebook. On its final page, you wrote, "My skull may be shallow, but my thoughts are not." And you wondered, quietly, in the back room of the dress shop, how many lives had been redirected, limited, or lost entirely because of a system that believed the shape of bone could measure a soul. What if no one had ever touched your head with calipers? It was nearly autumn when you came across a lecture poster pasted to the brick wall outside the university extension hall. The paper had curled slightly at the edges from damp, but the bold type stood out clearly, beyond the bumps. A scientific rebuttal to phrenology speaker, Dr. Catherine Milner, MD, London School of Medicine, for women admission. 1 penny. You stood reading it for several minutes. Not because you needed convincing. Your lived experience had long since disproved the science of skull reading, but because something about seeing those words in public, in print, made your heart pause. You attended the lecture. The room was filled with a curious mix of students, working women, and skeptical old men, their faces drawn in lines of doubt and pride. But Dr. Milner stood confidently at the front of the room, her voice steady and precise. She held up a plaster skull. "This," she said, "is the seat of personality, according to Gall. But in truth, the brain's function cannot be mapped like a city. It is not geography, it is electricity, chemistry, and experience." She explained how phrenology had been used to justify slavery, criminal punishment, and the exclusion of disabled children from school. She even cited recent neurological studies, early ones, but promising, that showed behavior arose from networks, not knobs and bumps. You sat near the back, nodding quietly. Finally, someone said it aloud. After the lecture, there was a brief Q&A. One man, red-faced, likely a clergyman, asked whether people who had benefited from phrenology might now be disillusioned. Dr. Milner responded, "Those who were favored by it may have believed it. Those who were harmed by it had no choice. You left the lecture in the rain, but you didn't mind. You walked slowly, replaying her words. In the following months, you began to see a shift, subtle but real. Phrenology pamphlets became harder to find. The shop on Fleet Street that once sold phrenological busts closed its doors. A few old signs faded from the public walls. The word no longer carried the same weight. In a clinic where you once did laundry, a new nurse arrived, young, sharpened, and curious. She asked once why the records of mental deficiency included head measurements from 20 years ago. You told her, it used to be science. Now, it's history. She looked puzzled but intrigued. In private, you reread your notebooks. You thought about the children who had been cast aside, the men and women sent to institutions, and the decisions made on the slope of a forehead. You weren't the only one who'd suffered from phrenology's reach. People with epilepsy had been labeled criminal. Deaf children had been declared incapable of abstract thought. Women with ambition were said to have enlarged areas of destructiveness or secretiveness. The skull had become a prison before any crime was committed. But now, slowly, the bars were rusting. You began volunteering quietly, unceremoniously. A small literacy circle for women labeled difficult to teach. You read aloud. You shared your notebook. You listened. You taught others what you had taught yourself, that your thoughts are not shaped by the bumps on your head. Sometimes you sat beside a girl who rocked gently as she read, or a boy who needed to trace every letter 3 times before remembering it. No one measured their skulls anymore. They were allowed to learn. That was enough. One day, while sorting books at a second-hand stall, you came across a thick, leather-bound volume titled Phrenology, Its Principles and Failures. It was filled with case studies, diagrams crossed out in red, and notes in the margins that contradicted everything you'd once been told. You bought it, not out of reverence, but as a relic, a reminder of what had been believed and why it had to be challenged. That night, you placed it on a shelf above your desk, beside your oldest notebook and a tin cup that had long since gone unused. On the inside cover, you penciled a note: "We were never bumps, we were always minds." By the 1880s, phrenology had been reduced to parlor trickery and fringe fads. The medical profession had largely abandoned it, but its legacy, like all pseudoscience, lingered in policy, in language, and in the assumptions of those who still looked for weakness in form rather than soul. And yet, because people like you endured, questioned, and resisted quietly, others no longer had to carry its burden. You had once sat in a chair, while a man in gloves measured your head. Now, you sat in a circle, where a girl asked, "Can I write my own story?" You answered simply, "Yes, you already are." How many lives were shaped by tools that claimed to know us better than we knew ourselves? And how many more were saved because someone finally asked, what if they were wrong? The corridor smelled faintly of soap and varnish and institutional scent that clung to everything. The wooden benches, the nurse's apron, and the wool blanket you wrapped around your knees at night. You were not alone, but you often felt that way. The other inmates were either too noisy or too quiet. Some shouted at shadows. Some sat curled in corners, whispering to themselves. But you were different. You always had been. Your name was James Henry Pullen, and long before the world noticed your talent, it had already decided what you were. Feeble-minded. That was the term they used. Blunt, final, and irreversible. It appeared on the documents that led to your admission to the Earlswood Asylum for Idiots and Imbeciles in 1850. When you were just 15 years old, you had never really fit into the world's idea of normal. Born in Dalston, London, around 1835, you did not speak until you were 7 years old. When you did, your words came slowly, often slurred or incomplete. Your teachers labeled you incapable of instruction. Your doctors shrugged. Your parents, frustrated but not unloving, sought help. And the help they found led you here. The word asylum in Victorian England could mean many things. For some, it implied sanctuary. For others, it was a holding pen for the forgotten. Earlswood, at least on paper, was one of the more progressive institutions, founded by Dr. John Connolly and funded partly by Prince Albert himself. It was intended as a model of humane Quran institution that believed in routine, order, and moral treatment. But even at Earlswood, the expectations were low. The assumption was that residents like you would spend their lives in quiet, obscurity, occupying themselves with basic tasks and submitting to the rhythms of institutional life. There were gardens to tend, floors to sweep, and laundry to fold. The staff didn't expect much more. Until you found the tool shed. It began with a scrap of wood, a broken piece of cedar from a delivery crate. You were drawn to it, not out of playfulness, but because your hands itched with the shape you saw hidden in the grain. You borrowed a small knife from the groundskeeper and began to carve. Slowly, carefully, you shaped the fragment into a miniature horse, so finely detailed that even its ears were lifelike. A nurse found it days later, tucked beneath your cot. She brought it to the ward supervisor. He brought it to the asylum director. For the first time, they looked at you, not with pity, but with surprise. You were offered more wood, better tools, a corner of the workshop, and there, in a room that echoed with the clatter of hammers and the hush of sawdust, your mind began to unfold. You built, not just toys or ornaments, you built ships, detailed, elaborate, anatomically accurate, ships entire, vessels in miniature, with sails, rigging, and tiny cabins that opened to reveal even tinier furniture. You built a model of the SS Great Eastern that stood over 10 feet long and weighed more than a quarter. It had hundreds of pieces, all hand-carved, many movable. The rudder worked, the anchors raised, the cannons swiveled, word spread. Doctors came to see you, philanthropists, engineers. Even Queen Victoria was shown one of your works. They called you the genius of Earlswood. Some whispered idiot savant, a term not yet common but quickly gaining traction. But still, despite the praise, despite the admiration, you were never released. You were, after all, still labeled feeble-minded. Your verbal speech remained limited. Your social skills didn't align with the world's expectations. You struggled with loud noises, bright lights, and unpredictable people. You spent hours on a single hinge, or days adjusting a model masked by millimeters. The doctors wrote about your focus with curiosity, but also concern. One report said, "Subject displays remarkable skill and constructive memory, but is unable to comprehend abstract questions." Another noted, "Lacks awareness of time, has no concept of money." To them, you were a mystery, a puzzle, but you weren't confused. You were building your world as precisely as they had failed to build theirs. Inside the walls of Earlswood, you created beauty structures that stood in defiance of the assumptions made about your mind. You fashioned clocks, models, and musical boxes. You even carved a mechanical mannequin that could open its mouth and stick out its tongue on command. Yet, despite your talent, you remained confined. Not in punishment, but in paternalism. The Victorian world, for all its fascination with your skill, could not reconcile your genius with your diagnosis. They needed to believe that brilliance came with fluency, with speech, and with social grace. You had none of those. You simply had vision. Once, a doctor asked if you wanted to leave, or you didn't respond with words. Instead, you handed him a small carving of a man behind bars, holding a flower through the window. He smiled, perhaps thinking it poetic. But to you, it was literal. You weren't unhappy. Not exactly. The asylum gave you wood, tools, and space. But it also gave you labels you hadn't chosen, and a life path you couldn't redirect. You had visitors, admirers, even patrons, but never freedom. And all the while, the same word followed you from ledger to ledger, from admission book to obituary. Feeble-minded. What might your life have looked like in a world where your silence was mistaken for ignorance? The workroom was your sanctuary. Others called it a carpentry space, a crafts room, or a diversion for idle hands. But for you, it was sacred. The place where time bent and the noise of the world softened. The smell of sawdust, the weight of wood in your palms, the soft rasp of a file against cedar. These were your language. Outside this room, they spoke about you in third person. A remarkable case, some said. An idiot with the hands of a master. Doctors scribbled notes in thick folios, marveling at the contradiction between your diagnosis and your output. But within the four walls of the workroom, you were no contradiction. You were exactly as you were meant to be. You could spend days working on a single miniature hinge, crafting it to swing with perfect precision. It wasn't obsession, it was clarity. While others needed words to explain their thoughts, you built yours from brass gears and cherrywood holes. A mast, a lever, a pulley, they made sense to you in a way people rarely did. You preferred solitude. Crowds overwhelmed you. Sudden noises made you flinch. And your words, though present rarely flowed, but give you a project, and the world narrowed into order. Your caretakers came to understand this in their own limited way. They gave you tools, protected time, and most crucially space. You were the institution's prized figure, the artisan savant. When visitors toured Earlswood, you were often pointed out. Sometimes you were asked to demonstrate your tools, to wave at guests, and to pose beside your latest creation. You did so quietly. You did not smile. You did not speak. But you noticed everything. You noticed the way visitors whispered after you turned away. You noticed how some of the nurses called you the mechanical boy, as if you were one of your own wind-up toys. You noticed that none of the doctors ever asked what you wanted to build. They only marveled at what you had already made. You weren't ungrateful. You simply understood your place. One year, around your 30th birthday, you were asked to build something extraordinary. Not just a model, but a spectacle. Something to draw attention to the asylum's progressive methods. You considered the request for days, then quietly began drafting your idea. It would be a ship, not just any ship, but a warship, a man of war, with decks, cannons, rigging, living quarters, and even a carved crew. You'd seen such vessels in the illustrated books kept in the asylum's library. You understood their dimensions by eye, their proportion by instinct. Over the course of many months, you constructed the model. It stood more than 10 feet long, towering above your bench. Every gun port opened and closed. The rudder turned with a hidden lever. Inside, the cabins had furniture, tiny hammocks, and even opening chests. You carved miniature sailors. One was shaving at a basin. Another was peeling a potato. Their facial features were finely chiseled, expressive, human, and distinct. When the ship was unveiled, visitors were stunned. Even skeptical surgeons were left speechless. One paper called it the product of an idiot's mind, more wondrous than any genius of sound reason. You never corrected them. Instead, you added something no one noticed at first. Hidden in one of the ship's lower cabins, accessible only by lifting a tiny hat shoe, placed a carving of yourself. A small wooden man, seated at a table, head bent in concentration. The figure's hands held a miniature version of the very ship he inhabited. You had carved yourself inside your own creation. A man within a ship, within a room, within a world that didn't quite know what to make of him. Your doctor at the time, Dr. J. Langdon Down, was a man of science, but also of gentleness. He didn't entirely understand you, but he respected your work. He ensured you had supplies. He documented your creations carefully, presenting them at conferences as proof that intellect could take surprising forms. Later in life, Dr. Down would become known for identifying the syndrome that now bears his name. But even as he studied others, he remembered you, his most confounding patient, a man who never fit the categories. You had few true friends in Earlswood, but there were some who treated you with kindness. A groundskeeper who sharpened your blades. A laundress who saved you scraps of soft cloth for sales. A nurse who learned how to ask questions without words. You never asked for much, but you noticed when people showed care, and you gave care in return. Once, when a boy in the asylum broke his toy and began to weep, you quietly took it to your bench, repaired it overnight, and left it on his pillow. No one knew you had done it. You never claimed the credit. But the boy did not cry again. You spent years building not just ships, but clocks, furniture, tools, and even a wooden mannequin with moving facial parts. Some of your inventions were playful, some practical. A few were simply beautiful. And yet, through all this, your status never changed. The reports still listed you as feeble-minded. Your diagnosis was never updated. Your place in the world remained fixed. You wondered, sometimes, if your brilliance had occurred in a body that could speak fluently. If your hands had belonged to a man with status and ease. Would you have been a royal engineer, a shipwright for the Admiralty, a professor of mechanical arts? You did not resent your fate. You simply questioned it, quietly, constantly. On your 45th birthday, a group of Earlswood trustees visited your workshop. One of them remarked that your latest piece to intricate tower clock was evidence that even the lowest minds can be taught to mimic talent. You didn't reply, but that night, you carved a small figure of a man holding a mirror. Inside the mirror, instead of a reflection, was a ship adrift in stormy waters. You placed it in the drawer beside your cot. No one ever saw it. You continued building, continued carving, continued living within the limits that others had drawn around you. But in your world of gears and oak and winding brass, you were free. And what if the world outside those asylum walls had been built to fit minds like yours? It was winter when the newspapers printed your name again. Only this time, the headline didn't refer to you as idiot, genius, or mute marvel. It was simply a short column tucked in the middle pages of the Times. James Henry Poulin, resident of Earlswood Asylum and skilled mechanical modeler, has passed away at the age of 70, known for his intricately crafted ships and mechanical inventions. Mr. Poulin's work remains on display at the asylum and in private collections. That was it, a paragraph. Your entire life folded into a few neat lines. No mention of the years you spent carving beauty from silence. No mention of the complexity inside you that the doctors never could categorize. No mention of what it means to live a full life inside a box someone else drew. You had died peacefully in your sleep, they said, in your narrow bed at Earlswood, surrounded by carvings and paper patterns and the soft hush of distant footsteps in tiled corridors. Your final project, a miniature working water wheel, remained unfinished on your bench, a tiny piece of string dangling from a half-fixed cog. But before that moment came, you had left behind more than wood and wire. You had left behind a story one no headline could contain. In the last years of your life, your fame had become something peculiar. People visited Earlswood not to see a hospital, but to see you. Reporters called you the model patient. Medical students observed your methods. Art critics wrote sometimes clumsily about how your eye for proportion rivaled trained professionals. But they still did not release you. And, in a way, you no longer expected them to. Earlswood had become your entire world. Your tools were there, your space, your quiet, even your voice, carved in wood. Though labeled feeble-minded from the start, you had shown patience beyond most men. You had never struck anyone, never demanded more than you were given. You had taught yourself to read diagrams, calculate gear ratios, and balance structures by feel. The staff had eventually learned not to interrupt you while you worked. They had learned that silence did not mean absence. That routine was not the same as dullness. That devotion to detail was not the same as obsession. They stopped trying to fix you, and in doing so, they finally began to see you. But still, the law never changed. People like you remained bound by diagnosis, by social assumption, by the state you kept building. One of your final pieces was a cabinet, a plain-looking wooden case at first glance, but upon closer inspection, it opened to reveal a series of drawers, each one layered within the other like a puzzle. The first held tiny books you had bound yourself, filled with handwritten observations. The second, a carved figure of a woman in profile. The third, a small, mechanical bird that flapped its wings when wounded. It was never exhibited. You left it in your room. Someone found it after you passed. One of the attendants, who had always admired your quiet, tucked it under his coat and took it home. He kept it on a shelf for decades. In time, your name found its way into academic papers, into books about disability, about autism before it had that name. You became an early example of what the world would one day call neurodivergence. Not broken, not deficient, simply different. The same ship models that had once been paraded as curiosities are now kept behind glass, in museums examined, not as anomalies, but as art. Craftsmen study your joinery. Historians study your life. Psychologists ask what your story tells us about all the others like you who were never given tools, or space, or even a name. And still, you remain partly hidden in your notebooks, your gestures, your unspoken hopes. So much was left out of the records, but some of it survived. A visitor to Earlswood once wrote that you would stare into the trees for hours before beginning a new project, that you liked the sound of wind against stone, that you smiled not often, but fully when a carving mechanism worked just right, and that, when asked once whether you were happy, you didn't speak. You simply placed your hand on your workbench, gently, as if that answer was enough. Your life is still studied today, as an early savant, as a misunderstood genius, as a resident of an asylum who built ships no one thought possible. But the real lesson of your life is not what you built, it's what you proved. That intelligence is not always verbal, that art can emerge in silence, that humanity cannot be measured in bumps or boxes, and that sometimes the greatest minds exist where no one bothers to look. What if more people had really looked before placing the label? You sit at the back of a crowded chapel, in a stiff wooden pew, your legs folded awkwardly to avoid the aching joint that has never fully healed. The air is thick with coal smoke and damp wool. A single candle flickers beside the pulpit as the preacher raises his voice above the quiet rustle of bodies shifting and coughing. Affliction, he says, is the furnace of the soul. The Lord chastens whom he loves. A few heads nod solemnly. You remain still. You are not here to be healed. You are not here out of faith. You are here because it is winter, and the chapel offers warmth, bread, and perhaps the small mercy of not being noticed for a few hours. It is Victorian England, and you live with what they call a deformity, a twisted spine, a paralyzed limb, perhaps a stammer that locks your tongue mid-sentence. To the eyes of the moralists, your body is not just wounded, it is significant, a message, a mark, a test. The Victorians did not see disability purely as a medical condition. They saw it as moral evidence, a reflection of divine will or personal failing. In a world ruled by strict hierarchies, tight religious codes, and an unyielding belief in self-discipline, your physical condition was read like scripture, and religion, in all its complex and contradictory forms, shaped nearly every aspect of how disabled people were treated. Some believed affliction was a punishment sent by God for sins, whether known or inherited. This belief ran deep in working-class communities and among evangelical reformers. A child born with a curved spine, perhaps the parents had lived improperly. A boy who could not speak, perhaps the family harbored secrets. Others saw disability as a spiritual trial, a burden placed on a soul in order to build virtue. Suffering was redemptive. To live with pain was to live close to God. If you bore it quietly, without bitterness, you were considered noble. But only if you were the right kind of poor. Church charities often made this distinction. The deserving disabled those who attended chapel, obeyed authority, and remained meek might receive food, clothes, or a cot at the parish refuge. The undeserving, those who drank, begged, or refused to repent, were often turned away. You had tried to play by the rules. You folded your hands during prayer. You bowed your head. You never interrupted the vicar, even when he said things that made your stomach twist. Like the time he preached that the blind were blessed because they could not be tempted by lust, or that the idiot child was God's chosen instrument to test the family's faith. You didn't feel chosen. You felt cold, hungry, and unseen. Still, the church loomed large in your life. There were sermons every Sunday, hymns you had to pretend to know, and visits from clergymen who carried little books and asked questions like, "Do you accept your condition as part of God's plan?" It wasn't really a question. Those who did not accept were labeled bitter, ungrateful, and even dangerous. There were cases where people who protested their treatment were sent not to hospitals but to asylums, deemed morally insane for refusing to suffer politely. But the church's role wasn't just judgmental. It was also paternalistic. Christian charities ran many of the institutions for disabled people. The asylums, the schools, and the hospitals, they were often extensions of moral missions. Some were run by well-meaning women who genuinely wanted to help. Others were managed by stern committees of men who believed discipline could cure anything. One such place was the Home for Incurables, where disabled adults were given lodging, scripture, and strict schedules. No drinking, no loud speech, no visitors after sundown, bed by 8. Daily prayers are mandatory. You had stayed there once, for a week. The beds were soft enough, the food tolerable, but the silence at night was oppressive. Any sound, a cough, a groan was met with shock. One woman sobbed quietly into her pillow every night for the son she had lost. No one comforted her. During your time there, you were assigned chores, peeling potatoes, folding linen, and attending prayer twice daily. You kept your head down. You repeated the verses they gave you. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. But you often wondered, what if the meek didn't want to inherit? What if they just wanted to be seen? There were exceptions, priests who advocated for more inclusive theology, and nurses who whispered kind words when no one else was listening. A few even wrote pamphlets challenging the idea that disability was moral at all. One such tract made its way into your hands. It was titled "On the Equal Worth of the Afflicted." A thin booklet, only 12 pages long, but it said something radical, that God loved the disabled not because of their suffering, but because of their full humanity. You kept it tucked inside your coat pocket for years. Still, the broader morality machine rolled on. In religious schools, children with disabilities were segregated, admitted at all. In church-run orphanages, they were often assigned the heaviest chores, as if labor would purify their bodies. In some rural parishes, Disabled adults were denied communion on the grounds that their mental feebleness meant they could not grasp salvation. Even burial was a matter of morality. In certain cemeteries, disabled paupers were interred in separate plots and marked unremembered. The gravestones often bore no name, just a date, just a sigh. And yet, despite all this, religion also gave some disabled people structure, a reason to endure, a hope, however abstract, that their lives had meaning beyond what society saw. You once met a man at the chapel who was blind. He sang every hymn with full voice, his hands trembling on the edge of the pew. You asked him once why he sang. He said, "Because it reminds them I'm alive." That stayed with you. So did the image of the preacher's daughter who used her needlework money to buy a cane for a boy with a crooked leg. Or the nun who taught you how to write your name with your non-dominant hand when paralysis took the other. There was goodness, sometimes, but more often, there was indifference wrapped in piety. And when the sermons ended and the chapel emptied and the fire in the grate was allowed to die, you were still alone. Your body still ached, your stomach still growled, and your future still depended on whether the world thought you suffered correctly. Did enduring quietly really make one holy? Or did it just make you easier to forget? The snow came early that year, clumping wetly on the roofs of churches and pooling in slush outside the soup kitchens. You knew where to go before the streets emptied. The bells of St. Michael's rang at dusk, signaling not just vespers but warmth, a few logs in the chapel hearth, hot broth, and a cot if your name had been written in the register. You were one of the lucky ones that night. You had been seen, but not everyone was. A girl no more than 16, with a crooked hand and an unfocused gaze, had been turned away at the door. Her mother was known to the clergy for questionable morals, and though the girl had done nothing wrong herself, she had inherited that suspicion. The vicar offered her a pamphlet and a prayer. Nothing more. You watched her disappear down the snowy lane, her skirt dragging in the slush, and you wondered what was mercy worth if it had conditions. The idea of deservedness ran deep through Victorian Christianity. Religion taught compassion, yes, but only for the right sort of sufferer. Those who accepted their affliction without protest. Those who prayed even when they had no bread. Those who folded their shame like laundry and never raised their voice. To be poor and disabled was to live under a microscope of morality. Your posture, your tone, and your willingness to bear the cross of your condition. These were constantly judged, and that judgment was everywhere. In the sermons, of course, but also in the hospital wards, the parish notices, and the charity application forms. Does the applicant attend Sunday service? Does he refrain from drink? Has she been chaste? These questions were asked even before someone looked at your bandaged foot or the tremor in your hand. You knew people who had memorized entire psalms just to improve their chances of getting bread. People who pretended to be more penitent, more docile, more holy, not because they believed, but because faith had become currency. The church, for all its contradictions, was one of the few places that acknowledged you. And so, even when you questioned its teachings, even when it failed you, you kept coming back. Not for salvation, for recognition. One chapel you frequented had a priest named Father Ellicott. He was not unkind, but he was hard. He spoke often about suffering as a divine gift, how those who bore illness or infirmity without complaint would be crowned in heaven. You sat through these sermons quietly, but once, after service, you asked him, "Does heaven also crown those who complain?" He stared at you for a long moment, then said nothing. But after that, he looked at you differently. You weren't the only one challenging the old narrative. By the 1870s, new voices had begun to stir among the religious ranks. Some, like Octavia Hill and Josephine Butler, were part of reform movements that combined Christian morality with activism. They spoke of restoring dignity to the poor, of listening to those who had been silenced. Even within the church, a few brave preachers began to question long-held assumptions. One wrote a sermon titled "On the Misreading of Affliction," arguing that disability was not a punishment but a part of the human tapestry. Another published a treatise suggesting that Jesus, in touching the blind and the lame, had not cured them to fix what was broken, but to honor their presence. You copied that last line into your own notebook. To honor their presence. A radical idea. More radical still was the appearance of disabled preachers. They were rare, but they existed, men who had lost limbs in accidents or who had been born with impairments and who now spoke from pulpits. Their sermons hit differently. When they spoke of pain, it was not metaphor. When they preached about endurance, it wasn't just theory. One such man, Reverend Charles Little, had a spinal deformity and used a walking stick. You heard him speak once, in a cold chapel near the docks. He told the congregation, "Suffering is not a ladder to God. It is a place we meet one another." Some of us will walk differently, speak differently, and live more slowly. That does not make us less blessed. It makes us necessary. You felt something shift in the room. For a moment, you believed. But even among reformers, not all agreed. Some still clung to the image of the suffering saint, the disabled person as martyr, quiet and inspirational, never angry, never inconvenient. You'd been called inspirational before, usually after saying nothing, usually when someone didn't want to offer help, but wanted to feel kind anyway. You hated the word. You wanted something simpler. Food, fairness, a room with a door that shut, the right to feel tired without being told it made you holy. In one almshouse, you were asked to write a testimony, a short statement about your condition and how you bore it with faith. They said it was for the benefactors, that they liked to know the stories behind the donations. You wrote, "I do not suffer to inspire. I live because I want to live." They never showed that letter to the benefactors. They filed it instead. Still, small changes crept in. More chapels added ramps. More schools considered admitting disabled children. A few even began teaching sign language, not for show, but for inclusion. You started helping at one of these schools, not as a teacher, but as a presence, a listener, someone who understood. You carried a child's books when her crutch slipped. You sat beside a boy who flinched at every loud sound. You taught a girl with a stammer how to slow her breathing when she read. None of this was religious, and yet it was all sacred. The morality machine ground on in the background. Sermons still preached acceptance. Leaflets still urged repentance. But you had found a different faith, not in theology, but in people, in doing, in showing up. Once, when asked by a vicar if you trusted in God's plan, you simply replied, "I trust that people deserve better." And that was enough. But even now, years later, you wonder if the church had truly seen you not as a test or a punishment or a metaphor, but as a whole person. What kind of life might you have lived from the very beginning? It was a small wooden box that finally made you weep. Inside were letters, dozens of them, faded, creased, tucked away in the drawer of a church office when no one thought you were looking. Each one was a plea. "My son cannot walk. He is not wicked. My daughter has fits and cannot attend service. Can she still be saved? We were turned away because my husband is deaf. What do we do now?" You had slipped into the room to help sweep after the charity meal. The vicar had gone. The cabinet was unlocked. The drawer slid open easily. The letters, you later learned, were part of a forgotten effort from years back, a spiritual welfare review of the infirm poor. It never amounted to anything, just piles of unanswered words. You read until your vision blurred. The same phrases appeared again and again. "Please don't turn us away. We are not evil. We only want to belong." You folded one carefully and slipped it into your coat pocket. For the rest of your life, you kept it there. Because that was the heart of it, wasn't it? Belonging. All those sermons and tracts and hymns. "Just as I am. Abide with me. Suffer little children." They promised inclusion. But only if you first made yourself palatable, acceptable, quiet. But what if you couldn't be quiet? What if your limbs twitched, or your voice cracked, or your thoughts didn't come in neat, orderly lines? The Victorian Church, for all its sermons about compassion, often lacked space for messy humanity. It wanted lessons, not lives, symbols, not people. And the disabled were symbols of divine mystery, of punishment, of purity, of sin. Rarely just people. And yet, you had learned to carve out space where none was offered. By now, you were older. The pain in your legs had settled into a constant, dull throb. You moved slower, but people knew your name in the parish school. The girls greeted you each morning. The boys offered to carry the broom. No one called you a burden. No one asked if your limp was a lesson. You spent your afternoons in a small reading room behind the chapel, helping children who had been labeled slow, odd, or incapable. You knew how that label felt cold and final. You never told them to offer it up or to suffer well. You just sat beside them. Sometimes that was enough. One day, a visiting bishop toured the chapel. He saw you helping a boy trace letters in soot on the window pane and asked, "Is she one of the women from the Magdalene mission?" "No," the teacher said. "She's ours." It wasn't the most accurate answer, but it was the right one. You were no longer a sermon illustration. You were no longer a lesson in patience. You were part of something, however small, however quiet. Still, the church's machine kept turning. Institutions still required testimonies of faith before offering help. Disabled children were still denied sacraments in some corners. Clergy still preached that the body reflected the soul, but there were cracks in the machinery. Letters published in the Christian Observer questioned the exclusion of disabled parishioners from full worship. Some hospitals, like St. Thomas, began treating impairments as medical conditions, not punishments. One bishop even called for disabled men to be ordained. Progress was slow, but you had lived long enough to see the ground shift. You saw a girl with twisted feet walk to the altar and receive communion without question. You saw a deaf man lead prayer using signs, with the whole chapel watching in reverent silence. You saw a pamphlet titled Grace in every body passed out during Lent. None of this would have happened 50 years ago. And you, quiet, persistent, forgotten, had helped shape it. Not through protest, not through books, but through presence. You had kept showing up, through sermons that blamed you, through winters that chilled your joints, through years when your body was seen as something that needed to be redeemed. You endured, and in doing so, you made space for others, for yourself, for a world where the sacred might finally include the imperfect. You never became a preacher. You never stood at a pulpit. You never gave a formal testimony. But every time you stood beside a frightened child, or handed a cane to a woman too proud to ask or placed your calloused hand gently over someone as shaking wound, you preached something far greater. You preached that love was not earned, it was offered. And when the final sermon was done and your name was etched on a headstone behind the chapel, just your name and the words "she was here," that was enough. Because you had been what? If the church had always seen disability not as something to fix, but as something to understand. The tent smells like stale beer and sawdust, and the lamps burn hot against your face as you take your place on the stage. You are dressed not in your own clothes, but in a costume stitched for spectacle, bright, absurd, and designed to exaggerate what the audience has come to see. They call you the curved man, or the bearded girl, or the elastic skin marvel. You've had many names. None of them are your own. Outside, the streets of Victorian London pulse with soot and spectacle music halls, carnivals, traveling theaters, and penny gaps. But inside this gaudy tent at the edge of the East End, another kind of performance unfolds. Here, disabled bodies are the main event, the freak show. Victorian society both feared and fetishized the unfamiliar, and few things captivated the public more than physical difference. Dwarfism, gigantism, conjoined twins, missing limbs, extra digits, facial deformities, skin conditions, neurological tics. In a world obsessed with perfection, anything that deviated from the norm drew eyes and coins. For people like you, that could mean survival, or something close to it. You hadn't always performed. Once, you were just a child with a crooked spine, passed from poorhouse to charity hospital. Your difference always the first thing anyone noticed. Jobs were scarce. Pity is rarer. But one day, a man with a waxed mustache and a paper card found you. He called himself a manager. He offered you a place in a traveling troupe, a roof, meals, payment in coin, and attention. more than you'd ever had. You accepted. The show moved constantly Southwark to Stepney, Sheffield to Manchester, always with a new banner. Half man, half alligator, the living skeleton, the human pincushion, often exaggerated, sometimes invented. But the people came. They paid their penny or tuppence and pressed forward in crowds, eager to gawk, laugh, or recoil. Some would shout, some would whisper prayers, some would toss coins into a hat with downturned eyes. And you smiled when required, you waved. You became the thing they wanted you to be. But when the curtain dropped, and the gas lamps dimmed, and the crowd spilled back into the smog, you were simply yourself again, tired, unnamed, unheld. Most performers in your circuit were like you, disabled, though few used the word. A man with no arms who painted with his feet. A woman with a cleft palate who sang opera in a strange, haunting voice. A child with curved bones who danced on a platform built too high for her to step down alone. You shared space, food, secrets. You built a kind of family. Some truly enjoyed the stage. They leaned into the attention and wore their difference like armor. Others endured it, gritting their teeth behind forced smiles, knowing that coins beat starvation. The managers were not always cruel, but they were not your friends. They negotiated contracts without asking. They invented backstories to heighten your mystery. Stolen from a jungle tribe, born in a gypsy caravan, bitten by a werewolf, all lies, but effective ones. No one wanted the real story. Poverty, injury, birth defect, abandonment. The audience didn't pay for humanity. They paid for novelty. And still, this world, crude and exploitative as it was, offered something the outside rarely did. Work, a room, meals, even moments of pride. You made something with your hands. You earned your own keep. You weren't a patient. You weren't a pauper. You were on a poster. That mattered. Even if the poster misspelled your name. You met doctors, sometimes men with top hats and notebooks, who came not to cure, but to study. They took measurements of your limbs, your spine, and your jaw. They called you a fine specimen. They asked no permission. They always walked away saying, remarkable. You began to hate that word. The others in your troupe shared stories about audience encounters, some tender, some humiliating. One girl said a lady once pressed a cross into her hand and called her a lesson from God. Another said a boy tried to kiss her when she wasn't looking. You learned to expect nothing from spectators. No decency, no cruelty, just curiosity. You never performed alone. That was the rule. Each act followed another. The fire eater, the strong woman, the sword swallower, the bearded lady, and then you. Applause came in bursts. Boos less often, but always felt deeper. The worst nights were when the crowds didn't come. No pennies meant no food. No attention meant no worth. You began to equate visibility with survival. If no one looked, did you exist? And yet, you sometimes missed being unseen. One morning, a preacher showed up at the camp. He came not to condemn, but to pray. He said your lives were sad, sinful, and unnatural. He offered to help you return to decency. He brought pamphlets with titles like From Deformity to Dignity and Turn Thy Eyes from the Grotesque. You burned them in the fire pit that night because he didn't understand. This, as ugly, humiliating, and strange as it could be, was your life, your living, your choice. And yet, was it? You often wondered, if the world had offered you acceptance, education, or care, would you have chosen this path? Or had it chosen you, slowly, by stripping away every other option? Sometimes, on quiet nights, you sat outside the tent with another performer man with mismatched legs, who called himself Jasper and asked unanswerable questions. If I had been born straight, he once said, I'd have worked in a mine, broke my back, died at 40. But this made me a name. You nodded. But did a name matter if it wasn't yours? And what does it mean when the only place that offers you a wage is the one that turns your body into a spectacle? The posters changed with the season, but the names stayed the same. The half-woman, half-bird, the elastic-faced man, the lizard boy of Leeds. Each week brought new banners and handbills pasted onto pub doors. alleyway walls, and market stalls. Some audience members came to laugh, others came to gawk. Some came every week, convinced that staring at your face or your limbs or your skin would somehow answer their unspoken questions about what it meant to be normal. But very few came to understand. You had come to expect this. Not only the stares and the muttered slurs, but the way people clung to the fantasy. They didn't want to hear that you were from Hackney or that your mother still sent you scraps of knitted cloth. They wanted the story the manager gave them, born in a jungle, raised by wolves, touched by the devil, blessed by God. You were not a person. You were a moral lesson in flesh and costume. Still, there were quieter moments, strange flickers of something almost respectful. A man who asked your name and actually listened. A girl who offered you a daisy and said, "You're beautiful," then ran away before you could answer. But these were rare. What was more common were the scientists, the respectable men in waistcoats and wire-rimmed spectacles, who would wait backstage to prod your joints, or examine your skin, or ask to take your measurements. Some asked you to remove clothing, some didn't. They took notes, always. Some drew diagrams. None asked how you felt about it. Once, you overheard one say, "She seems cleverer than her appearance suggests." You wanted to say, "So do you," but you didn't. In time, the troupe expanded. Your manager brought in performers from abroad, some with real differences, others relying on paint, props, or padding. The lines blurred. Who was disabled? Who was acting? Who had a choice? It didn't matter. To the audience, everything was true if it cost a penny to see. Still, for those of you who lived this life every day, truth mattered. The strong woman with the cleft lip, who lifted anvils with steady arms, she wept at night when her muscles cramped. The boy with the fused fingers, who juggled with his feet, he feared the day he'd de-break a toe and be forced to beg. You all depended on your bodies in strange, brittle ways. And then there was the doctor. You didn't remember his name, but you remembered his eyes. He visited the show in Manchester and returned 3 days in a row, not to laugh or jeer, but to observe. He never smiled. He asked quiet questions. Then one evening, he approached you with a proposition. A permanent position, not in a tent, but in a museum. A medical display. You wouldn't have to perform. You'd simply be. You asked, "Alive?" He blinked. "Yes, of course," but he hesitated just long enough to make you wonder. You declined. You had already spent your life being looked at. You didn't want to spend its remainder behind glass. Still, the offer haunted you. What was the difference, really, between the tent and the case? In the spring of 1875, the manager announced you would be performing at Crystal Palace, a grand venue, clean lit, with hundreds of gas lamps, a mixed audience, working class and gentry. The air buzzed with anticipation. You wore your best costume, despite its silliness. That night, as you stepped onto the stage, you saw something you'd never seen before. A man in the front row, maybe a vicar, maybe just wealthier, stood with his young son. The boy, no more than 6 or 7, looked at you without flinching. Not confused, not afraid, simply curious. You met his eyes, and he smiled. Not with pity, not with awe, just recognition. For that moment, you were not a spectacle. You were a person. And then the crowd erupted into applause, and the moment passed. After the show, the boy returned, dragging his father by the hand. He stood at the rope line, looked up at you, and said softly, "I liked your voice." You hadn't spoken on stage. You rarely did, but perhaps it didn't matter. That night, you sat by the river with the others. You spoke little. You rarely did. But the fire was warm, and someone passed around a tin of cold potatoes, and someone else started humming an old song. You thought of the boy, his smile. You wondered what kind of man he would grow into. Would he remember you? Would he become someone who stopped to listen, or someone who only stared? The next day, you resumed the tour. Sheffield, then Leeds, then back toward London. The posters were printed. The costumes were repacked. Your joints ached more now, and your skin didn't heal as fast, but you were still working. You still had a name, even if it wasn't the one they used on stage. And still, you asked yourself, in a world that only saw your difference when it was exaggerated, what would it take for them to see your humanity? The crowds thinned. Not dramatically, just a few empty seats where there used to be pushing and shoving. Then came the rumors new entertainment was on the rise. Magic lantern shows, moving pictures. The world was beginning to trade live human difference for manufactured illusion. You were getting older, too. The long travel days wore on your joints, and the cold seemed to reach deeper into your bones each winter. The makeup was harder to wash off. The smile is harder to hold. You started refusing certain towns, refusing to work on Sundays, refusing the more humiliating routines. Your manager didn't argue. He simply found younger acts to fill your place when needed. He called it rotation, but you knew it for what it was. A slow fade from center stage, but you didn't mind. Not entirely. You had begun carving small wooden figures in your spare time. One of yourself, as you truly were. Not the poster, not the costume, just you. Bent, tired, still here. Sometimes, after a show, you would place it on your nightstand and stare at it for hours, not out of vanity, out of defiance. This was the version of you no one ever paid to see. In 1881, you left the circuit. There was no announcement, no farewell show, just a quiet conversation with your manager in a back room filled with Moffatton costumes and old props. "I'm tired," you said. He nodded, adjusted his collar, and said, "I'll keep a place open. If you change your mind." You never did. You found a room in a boarding house run by a widow who'd once been in a theater herself. She understood the aching silence after the applause ended. You worked odd jobs polishing brass, fixing shutters, sweeping walks. You no longer performed, but your body was still your livelihood. Sometimes people recognized you in the street, not always by name, just a look of delayed recognition, a whispered, "Wasn't that?" You pretended not to hear. You had learned to vanish in plain sight. You visited museums sometimes, peered through the glass at wax figures, mechanical dolls, and anatomical models. You felt something like kinship with the mannequins. Posed, frozen, observed. One afternoon, you wandered into a public lecture. The speaker was a young woman, unassuming but firm. Her topic, the ethics of exhibition. On the display of the human body, you sat at the back. She spoke of autonomy, dignity, and consent. Of the blurred line between education and exploitation. She spoke of the history of freak shows, not in condemnation, but with care. She said, for many, the stage was the only space they were seen. But being seen is not the same as being understood. You nearly stood up, nearly spoke, but you stayed silent, as you always had. Afterward, you left a note on her lectern. Just 3 words. "I was there." She never knew your name, but maybe that was enough. In time, the world moved on. Freak shows became old-fashioned. Some troupes dissolved, others adapted. A few survivors opened curiosity shops or worked in vaudeville. Many faded into poverty. You lived modestly, but you lived modestly. But you lived. Sometimes children from the neighborhood came to you for stories. You told them tales not of the stage, but of the road, of smoky inns and storm-wrecked tents, and fellow performers who sang off-key, but with full hearts. You never told them about the names you were given, or the laughs that cut too deep. Once, one child asked, "Were you famous?" You said, "For a time." Then you added, "But not for the right things." In your final years, your hands shook too much for carving. Your legs buckled on cold mornings. But your mind stayed sharp. You remembered every face, every banner, every step onto every creaking stage. You wrote a short letter before you died. You didn't leave it for family. There was none left. You left it with your landlady, sealed in a tin box, labeled simply, in case someone asks. Inside, it said, "I was not an exhibit. I was not an example. I was a person. And I was watching you watch me. Let the next person be seen whole." You were buried quietly. No headliner, no headline, just your name and 2 dates. But in a museum, years later, a small carving was found. Your carving. No plaque, just initials. The figure sat on a low shelf, tucked behind glass, beside a faded playbill, with the words, "The Marvel of Nature Herself." Some curator placed the two together. Visitors paused. They looked. Some even read. But now, the difference was this. They knew there had been a real person beneath the velvet cape, behind the curtain, beneath the label. You. What does it mean that you had to make a spectacle of yourself to be noticed, but had to disappear to be remembered?